And away we go from the news capital of the world, Chicago, Illinois. It's time for the Ayn Rand Center UK's Daily Objective. You know, we're from the UK, but really we're from all around the world. We've got a fascinating guest with us today, talk a little about what's happening in the UK. But you're with us, as I said, on the Super Chat, on Clubhouse, on any number of audio apps before and after the fact. So we're happy to have you with us, and we're happy to have our tremendous guest from Germany today, Steffen Henne. He is the head of research for the Center for Industrial Progress. And we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the UK. We've got a swath of energy companies going bankrupt, 9 already in just the last couple of weeks. But maybe bigger picture, the war on energy writ large, both in the UK, in Europe, and even here in the US. So we'll get into all of it, and of course, take your super chats as well. But first, welcome, Steffen. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. All right, so bring our audience, our global audience, up to date. Those who maybe haven't been following it so closely. Headlines in all the UK papers that now 9 energy companies in the United Kingdom have gone bankrupt as prices have been soaring. What's going on?
Yeah, so energy has been tight across the board in the UK specifically, but in all of Europe to some extent. That goes for electricity. One of the interconnectors to mainland Europe has failed recently. It will be out of commission until end of the month, and part of it until March next year, actually. This is important for the electricity prices because the interconnectors are obviously important for electricity prices in terms of unreliable solar and wind generation, requiring some interchange between different regions, as they are unreliable and spike in generation and have shortfalls and so on. So that's creating a problem on the electricity side, but there's also a problem with the natural gas supply. The storage facilities are very low, and if there's a sort of severe winter, that's still possible in Europe, despite climate change. Fears are that there will be insufficient supply, or at least another price spike. So currently, the wholesale market prices are very high. They have tripled recently for natural gas, I believe, and this crisis might go into the winter season, which is very problematic. And the UK obviously had in recent years already problems with fuel poverty, what the government calls fuel poverty, like a high price for natural gas and electricity, and that leads to severe problems, particularly during winter season when heating energy is an issue.
Well, it's so interesting is that it's not like the cold weather is a surprise. It's come every winter. It's going to come every winter, certainly in the UK. So what is it this time around? Is it simply, as you said, an interchange? And how much of the fact that the supplies are so unreliable has to do with the mandates and the mandatory dependency on, I know what at the center you always call unreliables in terms of the so-called renewables. How much of these outages and these bankruptcies specifically have to do with that form of regulation in the market?
So there's an immediate cause, or there are several immediate causes. One is the breaking down of the interconnector. For the natural gas, allegations are that the state gas entities in Russia have been throttling down the supply of gas for some time now, and this depleted the storages. And I mean, there will probably be an investigation into that. I don't know how much information we can get from Russia, but certainly Russia seems to strategically benefit from that. The underlying cause of that is not the immediate cause. The underlying cause of that is, of course, that we are dependent on Russia for a significant share of European natural gas. And as I said earlier, it's more and more important that this integrated European power grid is interconnected and is able to cope with the increasing amounts of unreliable solar and wind, which have been on the increase in the UK particularly.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me probably like another example where what's going to be blamed, what's the headline of The Guardian? Power companies are going out of business, leaving customers, in the lurch. But the real story, and of course, it's going to be the so-called free market that's blamed. But it seems like just like medicine, at least here in the U.S., the power market in the U.K. is anything but free. I mean, just a cursory look at some of these headlines. The Guardian mentions an energy price cap, which caps the prices for 15 million households. So if suppliers can't even raise prices, then that's certainly not a free market.
Yeah, there are also like green energy levies on all of the combustible fuels in the UK. So the basic scheme is always the same, and it tries to expand renewables, and in most cases this is solar and wind because nothing else really scales. And so there's always a heavy regulatory hand in the energy market, and it has been really forever. Of course, in this mixed economy, the left wing will always blame like capitalism as if this is a thing in these markets. And in energy, it's particularly not the case. Like even in the United States, people have been blaming like the February Texas blackouts on the free market, when Texas has anything but a free market in electricity, of course. It's a state entity regulating this. You cannot enter the market. You cannot leave the market without permission. You cannot, modify your capacity. You can be ordered to dispatch electricity. You can be ordered to shut down. The payment mode is regulated by the government. Who gets subsidized, what market payment mechanism is in place, and so all of that is heavily regulated by the government. And of course,
Stefan, and of course, energy companies and people in the marketplace rationally work to exploit those loopholes and little runarounds and workarounds as a means of making money on those regulations.
Yeah, particularly the large companies. One example from Germany, as many viewers and listeners might know, Germany is about to shut down its remaining nuclear capacity. And so the large companies operating these nuclear reactors are very happy about that. They will get billions in compensation for the premature shutdown of these nuclear reactors. And at the same time, they will benefit from the subsidies for the unreliables, for solar and for additional solar and wind capacity. And they have learned to comply with the government mandates and benefit from that and survive in this environment. It's usually the smaller entrepreneurial players that are bankrupt first. And that's also true in the UK right now.
Stefan, Ayn Rand has written so beautifully in The Return of the Primitive and a lot of her writings, about just the soul, the fundamental ideas behind the environmentalist movement. But when people now in the UK are actually feeling it, when their energy prices are really going up, or maybe they're cold because literally the energy has been shut off, are those ideas challenged? We know that the environmentalists are kind of leading us back to the dark ages, literally. But when it actually starts impacting people's lives, when they see, are they able to make the connection that maybe depending on windmills, when you've got a hell of a lot of coal in the ground, isn't such a good idea?
Well, it's a difficult communication challenge. I'm of course working at it, but this is a very complex situation. And so if you look at something like an electric power grid, it works well until it fails. So, and we haven't seen many failures yet, right? So the underlying forces make it more expensive. You can see that, but often in the public narrative that doesn't get tied to the specific policies pushing for green energy. And so it's very difficult to explain that because this is a complex thing. Like, how do you explain that solar and wind, for example, the raw materials and the manufacturing in China is super cheap and has become much cheaper over the last 10 years. That's a public narrative. That's what everyone knows. Yeah, of course, solar cells have become super cheap. Wind turbine parts have become super cheap. Now we are getting to see that part of that might be, Chinese slave labor and coal power in China, right? But this is difficult to explain. Like, how do these connect, right? How does the unreliability factor in? What's the problem with solar and wind going to near zero, right? How does that affect prices? And then in the academic world, people look at wholesale market prices. And that's also the wrong approach, of course, because wholesale market, as we explained, is heavily regulated by governments. So who gets compensated in what way, market price caps, and so on are in place. It's very difficult to explain everything that failed. It's similar to, why is it so expensive to build a mile of highway, right? That's not trivial to explain. You have to show, like, okay, environmental impact statements. If one rare species is there, 10 years delay, and so on and so forth. It's a communication challenge, but I think more and more people are going to accept reality and then ask the right questions.
Well, I mean, even to your point about the involvement, the not so subtle involvement of the government in energy policy. I mean, apparently there is what they call a feed-in tariff scheme, of which these companies are taxed. And the ones that have gone bankrupt now own something like, what is it, a million pounds, upward of £1 million that the government's not going to get. So again, there's that total misconception that somehow it's the free market that failed when it hasn't. Is it a good thing? However, I guess the business secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, we'll get that in post. We'll check that in post. But
I'm German, don't ask me.
All right. Well, basically, they've said that they're not going to bail these companies out. Isn't that somewhat of a good sign that they're going to let these private companies, quasi-private companies, fail and not start because it makes me think back to Northern Rock on the financial side, going back over a decade. The UK government has a history of bailing out companies. Is it a positive sign that they're not going to bail out and they're going to let these energy companies fail?
I mean, they also had something like emergency loans to the larger companies that take over the customers of the failed companies and so on. Yes. So it's a mess in detail. I'm not a friend of correcting an error with another error. So in this case, I would claim that it's a right policy not to bail out the failures. They made probably some wrong choices, in addition to the fundamentally flawed setup of the market. That's in my view, that's probably right from what I see. But the whole thing is a mess. It's a very, like, the UK is a mixed economy, like America is, like Germany is, but energy in particular in all these countries is even worse. So it's very difficult to say what would be fair here.
What's so fascinating, at least here in the US, is that there's so many demonstrable pieces of history where you can look and say, boy, deregulation really did a lot. I mean, you're probably too young to remember, but Jimmy Carter, who we think of as being this awful leftist president, and he also deregulated huge swaths of the economy, from like airline travel to even stock commissions. All those prices fell demonstrably, but there's something about energy now that, of course, not only was it never deregulated worldwide, but, to kind of borrow that phrase from Rand, check your premises now, because now, am I right, Steffen, that like there's this premise that basically use of the earth is bad. Any use of the earth is, now I didn't grow up with that, but that just seems to me like a given premise for anyone now. And it's those who defend reason, defend capitalism, students of objectivism. We're the ones who look, out of our minds when we say, no, it's my interest, not the environment that matters. What's changed?
Yeah, so I mean, this goes back to the 60s and 70s, where essentially some of the bad impacts that were actually there, like there were, in America, the famous stories about rivers being on fire from, pollution and so on. Some of these anecdotal or sometimes even systematic stories, the impacts that were actually bad and undesirable, made it into some kind of extreme policy where you would culturally now believe that, okay, the planet in its natural state is a perfect thing, and we need to preserve as much of it and restore it to that. We see this with, forced policies in California, or renaturation of riverbeds in Germany, where mosquitoes are coming back and things like that. So these kinds of policies take something with a grain of truth to it, some real legitimate concern, and then they turn this into a religious sort of sentiment, like a green extremism that puts nature above humanity. And so they don't ask, what's the best for what we at the Center for Industrial Progress call human flourishing. So what's the best policy for humans to have fulfilling lives and expand their abilities, grow their wealth, and so on. But it's more like there's a religious ideal of a perfect natural planet, and all humanity does is destroy it and impact it in a negative way. And you can see this, in IPCC reports and in regulations across Western countries. You can see something like a concept like use the best achievable technology to mitigate emissions, right? So the regulation doesn't even talk about what level of emissions is okay, what's the threshold where we can live with. There's going to be some impact. If we produce solar panels or wind turbines, there will be some impact, right? So that's not even the question. Buy the most expensive piece of equipment. That's the ideal.
Yeah, and of course that whole look. I don't. You guys really crunch the numbers and crunch the philosophy. Even more importantly, over at the Center for Industrial Progress. But it's pretty obvious that the only really way to have zero impact is
yeah.
I mean, that's the only way to do it. And ultimately, at least from my perspective, that's the environmentalist goal. One of the things that they're not proposing, but they have been proposing, they're not going to at this point, but it's on the table in the UK. I mean, talk about, you said correcting one bad action with another bad. I mean, maybe they're on mushrooms, I don't know, but they're actually talking about a windfall tax. A windfall tax. You've got companies going out of business, but they're not proposing a windfall tax, as if that's going to bring more investment, more investors wanting to come, more people wanting to invest in the private UK, energy sector here. I mean, what is your take on this? It's just another way of suffocating any semblance of a private economy that could potentially grow?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of politicians are capitalizing on sort of emergency situations, and they are saying, well, people feel insecure. Obviously, energy is highly important. Everyone implicitly recognizes this, and then this is a good way to expand government power and the power of certain political movements. So, like, which free market party has a real chance in the UK of getting elected, right? So later this month in Germany, we will hold elections, and the Greens are pretty strong, despite the negative impacts on energy prices. So since 2000, Germany's electricity prices have doubled, more than doubled actually, right? So this is a significant impact, but the Greens are really the voters' favorite.
It's amazing. It's almost like, it seems like the Germans and maybe the British as well, many in Europe are, they're not as religious to God anymore, but the green thing, I mean, some of the, Scott mentions, using the earth is the new original sin. So like, they're worshiping the earth now. That's like their new God. Part of what I like what you do at the center is you remind people a bit of history. And, growing up in the 80s, it was like Chernobyl. The lesson we learned from Chernobyl was nuclear is bad. Nuclear is bad. It wasn't, and one only need to see the recent Netflix doc to know that it wasn't nuclear that was bad. Of course, it was the Soviet Union itself, the collectivist communist state writ large. That was the problem. And in fact, I wanted to ask, why is there this dichotomy where nuclear seems to be so accepted in France? I mean, such a majority of France's energy comes from nuclear, but all throughout the rest of Europe, it seems nuclear has become kind of like a bad word.
Yeah, I'm not so convinced about France either, because so they right now get about 70% of the electricity from nuclear on average. And this helped Germany on several occasions, this reliable capacity in recent years. But so the French government has already talked about maybe reducing that to 50% long term and replacing with solar and wind, of course. So it's like this sentiment is really prevalent everywhere. And a huge problem is that nuclear capacity on net will probably decline in short terms. Like I talked about Germany shutting down nuclear for good in less than 2 years, in 1 year and 3 months actually. That will when the last reactors will shut down. And Sweden recently shut down 2 units. So it's really even even the nuclear reactors that are paid for, where there's no argument about their cost effectiveness, they will be shut down. And it's not that economics, a lot of people think that economics drive history, but that's not true. It's the ideas that drive history. And this cultural perspective about, splitting the atom, tampering with nature, this kind of thing, this really resonates with a lot of people. And I think it's a huge part of that is that our intellectuals have adopted this quasi-religion and are promoting it. And a lot of people don't give it much thought, but they then absorb philosophically that, okay, yeah, that's really a bad idea. We really want a clean, natural environment and organic food.
But even, the practical and the moral being the same thing. Am I also right in saying, again, you study this so closely, that there is no benefit to shutting down the nuclear plant? It's not like the temperature is going to change. Nothing's going to change. In fact, it's probably going to get worse because all of that energy, if it can be replaced, is going to be replaced by, I just say, more sootier options. No?
Yeah, so that's correct. That's technically correct. But the public narrative is, of course, we will use solar and wind. We'll increase the share of solar and wind. In the US, the next plan will be probably 70-80% renewables by 2035, I believe. That's currently in the budget reconciliation talks. That's a huge issue. And of course, this will not happen because it's technically impossible. There will be something like solar and wind plus gas, or solar and wind plus expensive batteries that have to be manufactured using some, creating some impact and so on. But, like in other religions, you get a narrative, and it doesn't really matter whether you get, 72 virgins in heaven or not, right? People believe that.
And it's just that sacrifice, right? As long as everyone's sacrificing.
Yeah, that really plays into the cultural issues in Europe. We have to do something, and we need to sacrifice something, and this kind of thing. It's really like it's fairly well adapted to the European culture, I would say.
Definitely. Forgive me. I'm just looking for people should definitely. First of all, go to the Center for Industrial Progress's website, pick up Alex's book, also pick up Ayn Rand's book, Return to the Primitive. I mean, her foresight, Steffen, am I right, into all of these issues? Yeah. I mean, she saw this, back when it was called the ecology movement. She saw this all coming. She saw that, that big picture, coming and really spoke about it. I think, and gave us, if you will, the intellectual ammunition to understand exactly what's going on now.
Yeah, it's frightening how relevant her texts are today. Like decades later, it's really coming to pass, and the problem, I believe, is since Ayn Rand's time, we have not made so much progress because we have not been very effective as intellectuals to convince the public of a different culture, of a different philosophy. And this needs to happen. So we can make a lot of technical arguments, and you probably know how much number crunching we do in Alex's books and in our other projects. But this is only the foundation. You need to really change the culture. You need to change the attitude of people. You have to make them understand that human life means impact, and the goal is not no impact. The goal is making the impact necessary or even beneficial to human flourishing, to human life. So that's the center of things. And if you fail to do that, what will happen is that we will get the same narrative over and over, that there's a perfect planet, we are ruining it, we need to sacrifice ourselves, and then it's a small step to sacrifice others to do that. I mean, imagine.
Well, I was going to say, what's so fascinating is that there's a Garden of Eden. I mean, I'm certainly not a philosopher, but there's like that Garden of Eden fascination that, if you eat the fruit, I mean, the religionists think of it like sex, that's eating the fruit, but the environmentalists, the ecologists think of it like touching the earth. That's That's the original sin for them. So it's just even though you could say the rightists, the religionists, and the environmentalists, those are two, it's the same self-sacrificial, altruistic collectivism that only Ayn Rand stands apart from.
Yeah, and it's you can see the parallels in everything. Like communism had this heaven narrative, when we are done with our cleanup work here, we will really have this utopian society where there is no government, there is no class, there's no difference between humans and so on. They painted this ideal. And then in contrast to that, there's also this hell narrative, right? So if we don't reduce our emissions, if we don't reduce our energy use, we will end up in a boiling planet where everything dies and humanity goes extinct. That's what people really believe. And it doesn't matter that the IPCC doesn't say such thing. It doesn't really, if you read the reports, it doesn't say that humanity itself is at all at risk of going extinct or even reducing the population. That their problem is that humanity will expand, will increase its population, right? And therefore its impact. That's their problem. So this extinction rebellion movement and so on, they are really absurd fanatics that don't even understand what the alleged scientific foundation of their movement says.
I want to take a moment to thank all of our super chatters. Robert, who's always got a clever pun, says, looking forward to an energetic discussion. Thanks, Robert. Marilyn, a wonderful contributions. Thank you for both of it. Enric says, thank you for clarity on the requirement of energy for human flourishing. And I agree with that. I mean, that's a great point that, as Rand always says, check your premises. And for most people, they start with that premise that nature itself is a value. Nature itself is an intrinsic value. And you flip those premises, on its head. And that's really unusual in terms of the whole discussion of energy. Well, what's so ironic is you said, well, UK is going to make it 45% renewable and the US is going to make it 75% renewable. What's just so funny, is not funny, but tragic, is that it's a given that some government's going to decide that. And I mean, can you imagine back in the old days in London or even Germany, when the skies were full of soot and it was the early days of the Industrial Revolution, if government said, no, you have to shut down a lot of these factories because you have too much soot in the air. How much progress writ large would have been completely destroyed if government had those types of environmental mandates back then.
Yeah, well, before, we started to understand that, too much air pollution is actually detrimental to the health of people who live to the age of 80 or 100, as we do today. In Manchester 1800, people believed like, oh, the smell of the factories and the chimneys, that's really healthy, because the people in the city, of course, lived far longer than in the rural areas, right? Of course, you have to take into account that we have technologically progressed since then. So we don't want something like, the air pollution levels of Chinese cities here, but we can afford to avoid that and still have more prosperity. So, it's a moving target in a sense. We can now afford to have a far cleaner industry, but what we cannot afford is killing our industry with regulations that have this last 0.001% of emissions eliminated at any cost, because that will ultimately cost our lives.
Yeah, I mean, I love, as you often so point out at the center, I mean, there's so often, if not always, reasonable technological advancements to any of the so-called problems of ecology. The solution is not sacrificing humankind, it's humankind coming up with, we're like a better mousetrap. I mean, isn't the age-old example is that Amsterdam is below water, we build dikes, we build all types of things that harness environment, that make energy work for us. And one of Rand's great quotes is, anyone over 30 years old, 30 years of age today, give a silent thank you to the nearest, grimiest, sootiest smokestacks you can find, right? Because it's those evil, sooty smokestacks that, I don't know, turn on the light when you need a light, or give you hot water when you want to deliver a baby, or I mean, any of what we consider to be remotely first world. It's exactly that technological progress that we have to thank.
Yes, and so even at our current level, so there's a question about how much progress was prevented by the regulations already in place since at least the 1970s. What would the world look like if we had actually realized what would have been possible? But just look at the world today. Like 2.5 billion people, cook with dung and wood, with primitive biomass, and get real indoor air pollution that actually threatens their health. And it's something like 800 million people don't have any electricity. Think about that. You don't have a refrigerator. You can't turn on a light. Nothing. And they have no chance for a productive job. And so just this first hurdle, getting this first initial job that drags you out of poverty and then gives the next generation a chance to build on that, that's denied to them. And if we just phase out fossil fuels, which is over 80% of current energy use worldwide, they are never going to have that, because we cannot, power Africa and developing Asia with solar and wind. It's not going to happen. It's too expensive for Germany and America and the United Kingdom. It's definitely too expensive for people who don't even have a light switch.
Yeah, and it, again, it's not exactly my area of expertise, but there's nothing that keeps, in my opinion, Africa from becoming as prosperous as, isn't it at the same longitude as Atlanta or North Carolina? There's no reason there can't be tremendous prosperity in any part of the world that adopts, we always see it time and again, any element of freedom that's adopted, you see prosperity, wealth creation, human flourishing as a result. But as you said, if these primitive economies are from the get-go, shackled with, dependence on restriction of their energy use, they're never going to get off the ground. And of course, no one's ever going to want to invest in any of those economies either. So they're never going to get the capital they need to grow.
Yeah, that's true. And the problem compounds then. But so there are different things that need to converge, right? There's sort of the technological ability and the capital investment and so on. But there's also political stability, individual freedom that's necessary for them to capitalize on that when it becomes available. But right now, China is the biggest investor in Africa because they know Africa is full of very, very valuable raw materials like copper and other minerals. That's very valuable, natural gas, oil, and so on. So that's like Africa would be a wonderful trading partner if only we could get the political stability, individual freedom, and also the technological progress there. And that's really, really hard work, and it will take some significant amount of time. But right now, our global policies are making that harder, not easier.
And your point too about how quickly the ideas change and the ideas govern the society. The energy department of energy was only a cabinet level department in the U.S. in the 70s, I believe, under Carter. So as you said, a lot of that regulation that's come into all of these major economies when it comes to energy is only come in the last couple of generations. Of course, that's why I think so much of what we're doing here, I know that a lot of what you guys do at the center as well, is focusing on young people, right? Because it's those 22, 23, 24-year-olds that then go advise the next series of politicians that, ultimately change our lives and influence our lives politically. So thank you for what you're doing with the center and all the advocacies you do for the right idea, the right ideas. Thank you, Mary-Aline. Mary-Aline, I'll throw this to you, Stefan. She asks, what does renewable even mean?
Well, the basic idea is that you can do things over and over again without doing any impact forever. And that is sort of symbolic for the green movement, right? It's a dead end. You don't make any progress. You don't grow richer or anything. You just make do with what you have and live sort of an animal life, doing the same thing over and over again. That is really the idea behind Renewable. And because we have lost so hard for the last few decades philosophically, this is appealing to a lot of people, unfortunately.
Yeah, what's so funny is everyone here, at least in the first world, romanticizes living off the grid. Oh, living with a sustainable renewable. That all sounds great until you want a space heater, or you're cold, or you want some light, and you say we are so accustomed to life in this tremendous first world where you can plug in. And I mean, it's almost impossible, I think, for people to realize what an amazing accomplishment that is to have electricity, as you said. And without it, you know, how difficult it is. I mean, it's like people say, well, use your phone. Well, you don't have consistent electricity. How do you even charge the phone? So, you know, it's all about energy. One of our Mark says, more Stefan, bring him back soon. All right, Stefan, you're getting a lot of love on Super Chat as well.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, you know, Duncan says the war on fossil fuels and the hatred of Prometheus is the biggest threats to civilization. And isn't that kind of point, is that energy literally fuels everything. And the bigger government becomes, the bigger it encroaches and hates on it, to use Duncan's term, the worse our lives become.
I recently crunched some numbers for Alex's upcoming book, Fossil Future, which will be published in February. So every American essentially gets something like 75 machine slaves, you know, fed by energy, compared to the kilocalories that every American on average takes in every day. So this is sort of 75 machine servants serving every American every day. That's the equivalent in our machine labor society compared to the manual labor society. So we couldn't imagine to have such wealth, you know, even manufacturing a smartphone or anything, or traveling like dozens of miles a day, you know, without that.
Or even something like doing laundry. Like, you know, the idea of a reliable washing machine or, you know, dryer, things that we don't even think about now that, you know, keep bodily hygiene, keep the modern society going. I mean, to Duncan's point, it's energy that keeps it all running. And
having
Stefan,
specialists have time to develop a vaccine against the pandemic, you know.
Right.
Whatever you think about it, just the ability to have people specialize in that takes time, and you have to take the daily burden of getting water, getting food, and so on off them to free up their time to think about complex issues like that.
Yeah, I guess that's I kind of go back to that whole. I just don't think in the 50s people said, "Oh, I want to live off the grid." Without any connection to the environment. There was a sense of, oh, I want to be connected, I want technology. And now this romanticism, I mean, you know, Dr. Peikoff in one of his podcasts said that the ecology movement is what the kids protesting in Vietnam, I'm paraphrasing, but something effective like, that's what the protesters in Vietnam came up with after the war ended. You know, that's what they kind of came up with. And to your point, I mean, there's something about that fascination with living off the grid. I think, you know, you don't know what an awful life that is to live that subsistence life, where how much of percent of your day is just taking care of scrounging for food, scrounging for water, keeping yourself clean, all those things that the machines do for us now.
I mean, there's a huge difference going on vacation on a hike where you have no connection, but you know every time you need to come back or you have an emergency, you can just call in the helicopters, right? That's a huge difference to actually living in that poverty, having to move to fetch some water every day. You know, that's grinding manual labor work. And we know why the poor people in the world have such a low life expectancy compared to what we have.
Yeah, well, I like also you make that point very frequently at the center, is that, you know, there's a correlation between energy usage and life expectancy. And this notion that, well, the more energy people use, the worse life becomes. I mean, you refute that over and over again. You do it so beautifully. I want to throw it to Phil. Thank you for your generous contribution. Phil asks to you, Stefan, what's the consensus at the Center for Industrial Progress as to irrational political gibberish? Sorry if I've already discussed it, I'm just in. Well, certainly there's a lot of that going on now in the UK, blaming the so-called private power companies. What's your take at the center about all what politicians say on these issues?
So one of the problems is that the politicians are involved in everything and in very detailed technical issues, and they obviously cannot have a clue what they are talking about, right? It's impossible for them to know with precision what they do. So part of my opinion is get the government out as much as possible, right? Of course, there needs to be some framework of liability and so on, so people don't violate other people's rights. But other than that, separate state and economy, right? Like real capitalism. And, politicians sell something. Politicians sell a narrative and they want to get reelected for the most part, right? And the most successful politicians are not the most honest and most best informed politicians, right? And that needs to change, I believe, with the voter. That's my personal opinion. It's not representative of the Center for Lasting Progress, but I think we have to start with the voter. Like, what's culturally driving this? Why don't people ask the right questions? How do we get them to try and get informed about concepts? You don't need to, you can be a competent driver without knowing all the, details about the engine of your car. You can grasp the concept fairly easily. So, I just promote energytalkingpoints.com, one of our projects here. You can get very condensed information there. And you will also find a lot of primary source references. So if you want to dive into the depths of each issue, you can get the details there. So we have entries about the Texas electricity crisis, California blackouts, certain policies, and so on. You can look that up and share that. It's a tweet length talking points, and you can share that. And I believe it has to start with the voter and the informed citizen.
Absolutely. As Dr. Brook always says, we get the politicians we deserve. They love to see that our title of our show today is the war on energy. At least here in the States, people love to see the energy CEOs grilled by congressional idiots, to your point, who don't know anything. They love to see that them getting getting down on those successful energy CEOs. So until that culture changes, that's what the politicians are going to do. Enric's got a follow-up. He says, he observes, I should say, corporations are getting on the bandwagon. There's a bank and investment firm with flashy ads for selecting them for green-only investments. So that's even become hip now, is only investing in green-only investments, I suppose. Even that's hip.
Yeah, that's like in banking. That's the latest fashion. Not investing in fossil fuels and investing in green things, and selling carbon credits. So you can sell indulgences and sort of make good for your actual emissions, right? And pretend that they didn't happen somehow. Like Bill Gates does this, for example. He writes in his book, like, I felt so guilty about flying in a private jet. But then I now buy offsets for all of my flights. Yeah. So you're still emitting the same amount, but you're pretending that you're not emitting. I get it. But so that's the latest.
It's like tithing, right? So it's like he puts a little more in the jars that goes around to
if you're a billionaire, you can buy a good reputation like this, I guess, with this narrative. But it's the latest fashion. There's also in development banks that are, not funding coal power plants in Africa and Asia and so on. There are really dramatic impacts in this, and this has taken over the corporate world. And there's you mentioned like corporations are blamed. Yes, it's true. There are also evil actors in the corporate world that really capitalize on this kind of thing, and that, for example, pretend that they're 100% renewable energy users or something like that. That's really dishonest and really lies. And then in the detailed reports, they will explain how they lied, essentially, right? But nobody will notice that. Nobody will read that. So there are bad actors in this environment, and it's no surprise. Like the culture drives this, the philosophy, the green philosophy at play drives this, and it drives this in government and in corporations and also in individual voters. And we need to change it. I think the best point of entry is the voter and the consumer. So if voters and consumers will tell the corporations, hey, look, you're lying. I don't want to do business with liars. So better change your attitude. I think that would be very powerful.
I mean, you're right. There's a kind of cultural momentum afoot. It seems like in the 80s, at least on the corporate side, it was kind of globalization. That was the trend, everyone. Then it was kind of internet and digital in the late 90s. And now it's, at least from my perspective, it's sad to see it, but now that obsession is with renewability, environmentalism, and that is the kind of, it sells. Kathleen, thank you for the £5. She says, fantastic work coming out of the Center for Industrial Progress. Given me a heads up on future green investments, which I'm skeptical can pay for themselves, lack skills anyway. So kudos to all of your work at what you're doing and monitoring all these situations around the world in the UK and the US and everywhere else. So we'll visit the website. And what's your, how do we get in contact with you? Like, what's your Twitter and what's a great place we can follow your work?
I'm currently very passive on Twitter. I just use it as a sort of headline search right now. If you want to get weekly updates, go to alexepsteinlist.com. Alex Epstein is, of course, the president of Center for Industrial Progress. And you can subscribe to the newsletter. Industrialprogress.com is the website. Energy Talking Points is the most active project right now. And you can pre-order Alex's book coming up in February, Fossil Future. These are the main things. All of this has fingerprints by me on it. And if you have a specific question or idea or something else, Steffen at industrialprogress.net, STEFFEN, just contact me directly, and I'll try to answer questions.
Awesome, Steffen. Well, we talked a bit before we came on, and you mentioned that you're a student of objectivism, and we all are here at the Ayn Rand Center UK, but we also all have these interesting areas of specialty and expertise, and you certainly have one, and the work has just been so beneficial to me, and I know so many of our viewers from around the world. So thank you, keep it up. Such a voice of reason on such an important topic. So we really appreciate it.
Thank you as well. I appreciate the Ayn Rand Center UK. I watch many of your videos, so it's impactful, I think.
And who's your favorite host on the Daily Objective? Do you have a favorite?
Mark Pellegrino obviously is a star on the show. I like yourself, of course. So Mark Pellegrino, I think
you started with Mark, though.
Yeah.
Mark was the first one.
Mark is really impressive, I think. So
okay,
I would like to as well.
We're out of time, Stefan. Thanks. No, truly, thank you so much. We don't have a clubhouse today, but we will see you tomorrow with more of the Daily Objective, and later today with more from the Ayn Rand Center UK. Thank you again. Be well.
Thank you.